Welcome back to Criminally Human, where behind every headline is a person, a story and a tragedy that didn't have to happen. This won't be a long video. Normally, I don't like to discuss politics and religion because I want this space to stay open to everyone. But this time, I felt it was important to acknowledge the story, not from a political or religious angle, but from a human one. Because at the end of the day, grief and loss touch us all. Before we dive in, a quick heads up. We're going to talk about some heavy, uncomfortable truths. These are the kinds of things that need to be said, even when they're hard to hear. This isn't about sharing my opinion. This channel exists to give a voice to those who often go unheard. And that's what Criminally Human is all about. Yesterday was the anniversary of a terrible attack on America known as September 11th. While Americans woke up to mourn and reflect, there is a wife who woke up without her husband, and two children who woke up without their father. Charlie Kirk was a man who lost his life on September 10th, and no matter how people may have felt about him, no matter what opinions surrounded his name, he was still a person whose life was taken away. His death left scars that will stretch across his family's lifetime. Charlie Kirk was speaking at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. He was hosting a campus event as part of his American Comeback Tour. He was at his signature Prove Me Wrong booth under a white pop-up tent, addressing a question about mass violence and sensitive topics. Moments later, a shot was fired from a nearby building. Surveillance video shows part of the event, out of which Charlie was struck in the neck. He was rushed to the hospital but succumbed to his injuries that same day. He was 31. Authorities quickly responded. Law enforcement recovered a weapon suspected in the attack. They released photos of a person of interest and urged the public for tips. Some people were detained immediately afterwards, but investigators later released them, saying they were not connected to the attack. Reactions poured in. President Donald Trump, public figures across party lines, business leaders, and many of those who disagreed with Kirk's views expressed grief, concern, and warnings about political violence. Supporters saw him as a powerful voice for conservative youth, someone who challenged liberal campus norms, free speech orthodoxies, and the woke establishment. Critics accused him of dividing rather than uniting, of amplifying conspiratorial rhetoric, of pushing viewpoints that many saw as discriminatory or inflammatory. He was outspoken, unafraid of confrontation, which gained him both support and backlash. His death raises big questions. What does it mean when a public figure with strong views can be struck down so suddenly in a public space? How do we balance disagreement with safety? How do we respectfully talk about someone who held views we may oppose, yet still acknowledge their loss? And when the headlines roll, whose voices get heard? His family's. Critics. The middle that often gets ignored? But let me ask you this. Wasn't there also a school shooting just 2 days ago? And why isn't that what's dominating the headlines right now? Every year, anniversaries of tragedies play on loop across every screen in America. For example, the September 11th attack. You hear the same archived audio, you see the same shaky footage, you listen to the same carefully edited tributes. Candles are lit, flowers are placed, and American flags at half-mast. For Charlie Kirk's family, his wife wakes up alone, staring at a bed that feels too big. His children carry the weight of knowing they will be growing up without their father's guidance. This is what anniversaries really mean. A reminder that the grief never left. The media makes it symbolic. Families live it every day. But while we're replaying one tragedy, what about the ones happening in real time? 2 days ago, Evergreen High School in Colorado. On September 10th, 2025, a 16-year-old student opened fire in his own school. 2 classmates fired at and wounded. Then he turned the weapon on himself. Investigators now say he'd been radicalized by an extremist network. A child radicalized. A child armed. And yet outside of Colorado, you wouldn't even know it happened. Before that, Annunciation Catholic School in Minneapolis. August 27th. 2025. Children had a religious gathering. There were 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds in their uniforms. A shooter fired through the windows of a church. 2 children were pronounced deceased. 17 more injured. Parents will never hear their children's laughter again, and a parish forever scarred, but the coverage faded within hours. And then in Washington state, a 13-year-old was arrested with 23 firearms, a manifesto, and evidence he was planning an attack on his own school. Imagine that, a middle schooler stockpiling weapons. His arrest stopped another massacre, but the story barely made a ripple outside local outlets. These are not anniversaries. These are 2 days ago's headlines, or worse, yesterday's silences. This is the part that should make you uncomfortable. While we're memorializing a tragedy from the past, and Charlie Kirk, there are new ones are happening in real time. And those fresh scars are barely acknowledged. Is it easier for the media to re-air the same anniversary footage, like the familiar September 11th tributes, than to deal with today's violence? Is it easier to show familiar grief than to ask why children are still dying in schools in 2025? Is it easier to focus on Charlie's death than to give the same attention to other tragedies? It is in fact easier, because those stories raise questions nobody wants to answer. So instead of sitting with uncomfortable truth, we distract ourselves with ritual remembrance. And families living through today's loss are left in silence. This isn't new. We've seen it again and again. Anniversaries dominate airtime while fresh tragedies are sidelined. Columbine is remembered, but how many smaller school tragedies since then have you even heard about? 9/11 is ritualized, but how many acts of violence from yesterday never get a second mention? It creates a hierarchy of grief. One life, one tragedy, one anniversary gets a full broadcast. Another is reduced to a crawl at the bottom of a screen. One family's pain is amplified, another family's screams are ignored. Charlie Kirk's death is honored today. His family's grief is spotlighted. And it should be. But while we're busy looking back, Evergreen High is living through its nightmare. Minneapolis is still reeling from children's lives being taken away. Washington parents are still shaking from learning a 13-year-old almost turned their school into a potential massacre site. Why do we pick and choose which tragedies deserve the nation's voice? Why is one family's grief amplified, while another's is drowned out? And it's not just America. Around the world, tragedies are swallowed by silence. A landslide in Darfur that killed hundreds. Floods in Pakistan that displaced millions. An earthquake in Afghanistan that ended over 2,000 lives. These disasters barely get a headline in US media, if they get mentioned at all. And why is that, you ask? Because it doesn't sell. Because the story isn't familiar. Because their grief doesn't drive ratings. Because they are not people in high enough places. Charlie Kirk's family deserves remembrance. They deserve compassion. But so do the families burying children right now. So do the survivors of Evergreen High. So do the parents in Minneapolis. So do the people in Washington who are just grateful that this time, police found the weapons before the bullets flew. Grief should not be a competition. Memory should not be a distraction. So I'll leave you with this. When you see the headlines today, ask yourself, whose pain are we remembering, and whose pain are we erasing? Because remembrance without awareness isn't honoring the dead. It's silencing the living. Let us never forget the ones they don't talk about and why they aren't mentioned as much. Now, let's have a moment of silence. This has been another episode of Criminally Human, where we remember that everyone grieves for someone, even when that grief is too often overlooked or doesn't have a televised anniversary each year. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again on Sunday.